Phrolova may end up revolutionizing Havoc. Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. As it currently stands, we only have one 5-star limited Havoc DPS in the game as of now, and that would be Camellia, who came out quite some time ago at this point. And she remains as being quite a strong option to this day, only ever gaining value over time, especially whenever Whimpering Wastes came out, solidifying herself as one of the most versatile DPSs in the game, being able to take on both TOA and wuwa very effectively. However, outside of Camellia, we don't have any other limited 5-star Havoc DPS. We do indeed have Donjin as a 4-star, who is a very strong Havoc unit. Especially when played by those that are of high skill. Seriously, Donjin mains are scary with how good they are at the game. I don't even think that the average Donjin main cared whenever Cantarella came out, because even if the Jellyfish Lady is indeed her best in slot within hypercarry teams, let's be real. We all know that Donjin mains are not playing teams anyway. However, outside of those two, we don't really have any remarkable Havoc units in the game. Tao Chi just isn't really that good. She had an okay use case in Jinchi teams back in the day, since her skill percent on outro is pretty nifty, but honestly, even back then that was quite the cope synergy. Roshia is just a case of a character who ended up getting absolutely annihilated by a pre-existing 4-star, because while she does end up being the technical best in slot for Camellia, it's just really hard to justify investing any amount of limited pulls into her when the upgrade that she offers is so minimal. And while she does indeed get better if you do invest into her more, that investment could be better utilized on basically any other character. And then there's Cantarella. This character actually does have quite a bit of potential, but we just don't really have a limited 5-star in the game right now that can really make use of her full potential. She's generally a very well-liked character thanks to her exorbitant features, if you will. But meta-wise, her best use cases at the moment are being used as either a Donjin hyper teammate, or being used in Jinchi teams because she's able to provide both coordinated attacks and skill percent on outro. You can also use her with other DPSs that enjoy utilizing skill percent thanks to that aforementioned outro skill, such as Carlotta for example. But otherwise, she released in a state of not really having any character that ended up being her definitive best in slot without question. She had unique mechanics in regards to restoring her concerto energy if echoes were used, and it's clear that the kit itself isn't bad whatsoever, it's just that there's not really any particular character that's really utilizing it at the moment. And unfortunately, despite being a limited 5-star Havoc character, there's not really much that she can do for Camellia. Yes, she can provide Havoc percent on outro, but Donjin can do that just fine as well and she's a 4-star, so there's really not much incentive to use them together. So what part is Phrolova going to play in all of this? Well, there's a couple angles that Kuro Games could take with her. First of all, if she ends up being a Havoc DPS, then we might finally have another use case for Roshia. That character is currently just really not worth getting, because while she is indeed good for Camellia, it's just not by a wide enough margin. So there is the potential for Kuro Games to finally give her another decent use case. And I don't really think that they would make Phrolova a support, because think about it. We already have 2 Havoc 5-star supports that just aren't really doing much. So I feel like making a DPS that's actually able to take advantage of them would make a lot more sense. Something interesting that I would like to point out is that we know that Phrolova is able to control echoes and has a general tie to those creatures, and Cantarella does have abilities in her kit which do tie to echoes, both in her Forte skill and in her I4. If I were to hazard a guess, I do feel like Cantarella did release ahead of her time. I feel like if she's going to end up being good for Phrolova, they're probably just going to rerun them together. It's typically how Kuro does things, to run the DPS with their best assault support. Of course, this wasn't the case of Shikona and Cardathea because she came out right before Cardathea. However, I do expect that whenever the Divine Maiden gets her rerun, she's most likely going to rerun with Shikona. Though it is worth pointing out that Cantarella's links to echoes are quite self-contained. She herself regenerates concerto energy whenever echoes are cast. She herself gains Havoc damage bonus whenever echoes are cast. It's not that she spreads it to the rest of the team. It's actually quite selfish, so that could actually be a point against them working together, and maybe Cantarella just has these unique mechanics for herself. But if Phrolova had anything to do with echoes, like making them do damage, reducing their cooldowns, amplifying their effects, just something along those lines, I wouldn't be particularly surprised. Not only because it would tie into her lore, but it would make for a very unique playstyle, and also utilize a character that just doesn't really have a use case at the minute. I'm not particularly sure if Cantarella was released in advance, as in she was made with the intent of a future character being good for her in mind, or if Kuro Games just kind of made her, and now she's stuck in a state of limbo because they didn't really know what to do with her whenever she came out. So now she actually has the chance to go and do something more substantial. I do actually think it's somewhat of a win-win situation, since if she ends up being very good with Roshia, then that ends up finally being a good definitive best in slot use case for that character. Well, she does indeed have Camellia as a best in slot. I do want to say, I do indeed acknowledge that if you do want to play the absolute best Camellia team, then yes, Roshia is the answer to that. It's just not really a big enough increase. But we could see her providing some actual significant buffs to a character and genuinely meaning something. The issue of Sanhua versus Roshia when it comes to Camellia is simply that Sanhua's rotation is so fast, and she provides so much basic percent, and that is the main thing that Camellia likes. Meanwhile, at S0, Roshia's field time is just too long in TOA, and she ends up being very good in Whimpering Wastes, but Camellia on her own is already absolutely busted within that game mode. She's not really a character that needs the additional help in order to clear that mode, because she is just inherently a very AoE character in her red hair mode. But if Phrolova is able to benefit from both basic percent and havoc percent, which Roshia provides in her outro skill, while also appreciating her attack buffs, then we could be seeing a genuine increase in the Clown Kid's value. Now I would like to add, there is something that's a bit conflicting here. Cantarella offers skill percent and havoc percent on outro. Roshia offers basic percent and havoc percent. Now granted, no character specifically has to have one overwhelming majority damage source for their entire kit. It could end up being a case like Absolution Phoebe. Our dear Acolyte's free-to-play teams can be quite flexible, because she does two main major damage sources, her heavy attacks and her basic attacks. If you buff up her basics with Sanhua, they end up doing pretty good damage, but if you use more Tiffy instead, that's also very justifiable, because her heavy attacks are very strong. Both end up being very strong options that are very relative to each other in terms of value. So if Phrolova ends up utilizing any amount of skill attacks or basic attacks, then both of those units are going to end up being at least somewhat decent for her. And if her damage share ends up having a decent balance between the two of them, well then what do you know? Both options are likely going to end up being just as good as each other. Granted, if she's really heavy on the basic attacks, then it could be another situation where Sanhua just ends up taking over, but it'll also depend on how much Phrolova values the other things that Roshia is able to bring to the table. I will say, I do think it is very likely that the Clown Kid walks out of this with basically no value gain, or if a value gain, then a very small one, because I do think that Cantarella is likely to be the main character that's going to be propped up in terms of meta value here, because she's released with basically no best in slot. You can argue that Hyper Donjon is her best in slot, but like I said earlier, most hardcore Donjon players do not care for teammates anyway. But yes, that is indeed a good use case for her, but she has no limited 5-star to really pair herself with that she can go and say, I am definitively really good with this particular one. I should add, I don't necessarily think that Cantarella is a bad unit as of now, because she is indeed a very good substitute for multiple strong DPSs. But it's undeniable that if she did end up getting a good Havoc DPS to support that could utilize her full kit in its entirety, yeah, she would definitely end up being a more meta character than right now. As for the conductor lady herself, she could end up just being really special because she's been hyped up since the very beginning of the game. We've known about this character for a very long time now. She had some prominence in 2.0 and has generally just been showing up here and there. So I have no doubt in my mind that Kuro Games is definitely going to try and cook up something special here. I do think it's unlikely that we get another basic attack-centric Havoc DPS because we already have Camellia, and as it currently stands, she's still a very good unit. Even now, she is performing well. Then again, there's not really such a thing as a bad Wuthering Waves DPS. But even with that being said, I do still think that Camellia is quite noteworthy because she's one of the most free-to-play friendly DPSs in the game, while also being very good across basically every endgame mode. So I do think that Kuro's going to end up separating them. I don't really think she's going to have anything to do with negative statuses, because if she was, I think we would have gotten the Havoc negative status applier at this point. We got Shakona before the Erosion DPS of Cardathea came out. And Phoebe is both a DPS and a support for negative statuses. After all, they were very new at the time, and Spectral Frazzle was the first one that Kuro Games was introducing. So they made Phoebe an all-in-one package. And I have to say, they accidentally made one of the most valuable characters in the entire game. It's actually kind of comical how high value Phoebe is to pull for. But that aside, my point still stands. I don't really think she's gonna have anything to do with negative statuses. Now she might, and it could be a case where they release the DPS first and the support afterwards. And to be honest, I actually think that's better. I don't really know why they would release the support first when they don't have their best character. Because then it creates an awkward situation of wanting to skip them so that you can go and get whoever the DPS is first, but then whenever you get the DPS, they're just not going to be performing at their fullest because their support already came out, but whenever that unit released, they didn't have said DPS, and it makes total sense to skip a unit if their release date isn't up to par for you. So I actually wouldn't mind that change in direction, and she could end up being the Havoc negative status unit, but I just kinda doubt it considering that Cantarella has nothing to do with it, and Roshia also has nothing to do with it, and those two are currently the most underutilized Havoc supports at the current moment. Now granted, Kuro Games could be a little silly and just go, whatever, screw those two supports, they're just always gonna kinda be stuck in limbo, and we're gonna go and make this character do her own thing, and make her her own dedicated support down the line. In which case, okay, I guess. We can't control Kuro Games, they'll just do what they want. Granted, I don't really think this is going to happen, but they could also do something like a triple fusion situation, where Cantarella ends up being a third slot, who's going to help out a second slot that'll come out for Phrolova, but I just don't really think that's going to be the case. It made sense to do that for the fusion units because they're already very inherently flexible, but I can't really see that happening for two characters that are just clearly made to be second slot teammates. But either way, I can definitely see Phrolova absolutely revolutionizing Havoc as an element, whether that be by introducing some cool new Echo playstyle into the game, or just generally freshening up the Havoc element. I doubt that she's going to completely kick Camellia out of the meta. After all, she's a very strong character, and Wuthering Waves doesn't really have a weak limited 5-star DPS. But either way, she's definitely going to cook up her own unique niche, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Kuro Games is going to cook up with her. I really don't know what to expect after all. But what do you think about all of this? Do you think that Phrolova is going to revolutionize Havoc as an element, or are you not really expecting much? Let me know down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I have a silly second channel where I just kind of talk about literally whatever, so go and check that out if that's something that you're interested in. I haven't uploaded there in a while, but there will be a video soon, I hope. Hopefully this video was able to tell you why I personally think that Phrolova will revolutionize the Havoc element. This has been Juice, signing out. And no matter how crazy Phrolova may end up being, she is never going to be as crazy as the average dungeon main.